continuing with mechanisms for evolution, we're looking at the next one, which is genetic drift. So genetic drift, as you can see here, is a random change in the genetic makeup of a population. So this is a little different and odd. It's kind of hard to kind of wrap your head around without looking at some examples. So we are definitely going to do that. So you can see the big thing here, and I want to point this out, and I'll point this out a couple times, is that this is a random change. There's no direction to it. There's nothing pushing the change in the population. Okay. So let's take a look at an example. So this example is having this chin dimple. So you can see I don't have one. I have a smooth chin. And the thing is that in today's human population, this is actually a rare type of characteristic. So this is an example of genetic drift. So you can see here, this is what we would consider kind of what the population probably was to start with. So you can see we've got a large portion of the population, and you'll see a lot of these shown as pie charts from here on out. A lot of the population had chin dimples, but not, this other, just over a quarter of the population had smooth chins like myself. And you can see, I told you it was random chance. So it is like rolling dice. And so, they've got here things about genetics, but basically the idea is that any individual out of this population could reproduce with another, and it is random what their children will end up with as far as the genetic makeup. So there's no selection. If you think about natural selection, that means that there's something selecting for that characteristic. But here it is random chance on how these, we call alleles, basically the different versions of the gene, are going to change. So in this case, there are going to be more people in the population with the smooth chin like me. And over time, this can actually lead to what we call fixation, meaning that all of the individuals in the population actually have the same genetic makeup for that characteristic. Right now, we are probably in one of these two pies for this characteristic, because like I said, there are not a lot of people out there with this chin dimple. And it is genetic drift. It is random on which alleles you inherit. Now, if your parents both have the alleles or gene copies to have the chin dimple, then you're going to get the chin dimple. But if, you can see up here, if you have both parents who have a copy of each gene, that's why they're two different letters, then you can have some kids who end up with the combination for no chin dimple. All right, and it's just random on how that happens. You can see here, we'll talk about dominant and recessive. The chin cleft or the dimple is actually dominant, but it doesn't mean that that's the one that's going to show up all the time. So it's random which one is going to show up. So how is this different from natural selection? The stuff that we saw a little bit with Darwin that we'll talk a little bit later about more. The change in the genetic makeup is not related to genes that influence reproductive success. So the genes that are going to be subject to genetic drift are not tied to reproductive success. So think about like a chin dimple. It's not going to affect whether you can survive and reproduce, all right? So there are some other genetic drift, things like being able to roll your tongue, that's not something that's going to matter whether you can do or not, because it doesn't affect your reproductive success. Whether your earlobes are attached, so whether they come all the way down or if they have the little curve to them. Those are the kinds of things that are going to be subject to genetic drift because they don't affect your ability to survive and reproduce. Now, there are special cases of genetic drift, and I'm going to show you a couple of those. The first one is founder's effect. So founder effect for genetic drift is where genetic drift occurs, but it is going to happen because a small number of individuals are leaving a population and founding, founder effect, a new isolated population. All right. So, oh, there we go. So these, you've got a big group of people and a small group break off and go and move to an area where they aren't going to be reproducing with other groups of organisms. And what occurs is that founding population, the one that moved away, can have a different genetic makeup than the original population that they came from. And so this can create genetic drift because the founding population has that new different genetic makeup. And that founding population is not specifically picking individuals based on their genetic makeup. So in Ohio, one of the most common populations that you may be familiar with that has this founder effect are the Amish. So they have, they came from a large population, but they isolated themselves. They are no longer reproducing with the rest of the population at large. And so they're reproducing within their own population. And so if we take a look, here is that original population. Here's the little founder population. And when we look at them by themselves, you can see originally it didn't look like that second allele, that second type of gene made up a very big part. But when we look at the new population, it makes up a big fraction compared to the rest of them versus when we look at the big population, right? The big population, this recessive copy, this recessive gene, makes up a very small piece of the big population. But when they moved, you can see they took a significant sliver of those genes with them, and so they can have a different makeup of that gene. So one of the common ones in the Amish population that this has occurred with is what you can see in these pictures, and that's polydactyly. That's having extra toes or fingers. This is, again, not a trait that affects your survival and reproduction. A lot of people, these fingers you can see are actually functional. Sometimes they aren't. They can be removed, but they can also be left. And so not going to affect those individuals. And so this is one way that you can get a founder effect. You also can have what we call population bottlenecks. This occurs when there is a big event that affects all of the population at once. So, for example, a famine, disease, rapid environmental change, something that wipes out huge sections of your population, and it's not because of the genetic makeup that they have. So an example of this are cheetahs. So here you can see what we know it was probably the approximate genetic makeup for one gene, let's say, in the cheetah population, and they actually underwent extreme genetic change. Extreme environmental change. They underwent genetic change too, but they had extreme and rapid environmental change, and it killed off a majority of the cheetahs. We know we've been able to trace it back to figure out when this happened. It happened about 10,000 years ago at the end of the last ice age. And it actually allowed a very small population to survive. We've estimated it's about a dozen individuals or so that survived. And their genetic makeup is very similar to each other. They are much more genetically related to each other than they should be. And that's actually making it difficult as far as protecting them, because they are very similar as far as genetic makeup. So that is another way you can get genetic drift, is have something that, some sort of disaster that wipes out most of the population, leaving you with a very small genetic makeup of that population. All right, next agent of evolution is migration. So this one's pretty straightforward and simple. Migration is just moving in or out of a population, and it can affect the genetic makeup. So groups of organisms moving into a new population or out of a population can change that genetic makeup. So we're going to take a look at an example of that. So populations can be separated by all kinds of different things. In this case, they're going to be separated by a mountain. They could also be separated by, stream. If we're talking about insects, even something like a sidewalk could separate them. Okay. So here we've got our two populations. So you can see they are genetically different with our little pies. So a section of population one decides that they are going to migrate over the mountain range. Let's say they're birds. And once that migration occurs, we now have two new genetic makeups. This population one lost a good number of their green genes, and population two increased the number of green genes in their population. So, like I said, pretty straightforward for migration. The next video will be the last of the agents of change, talking about natural selection.